Mari, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time. I'm pleased to have you again on my series Breakfast at Kuznach. First of all, let me ask you, how are you? I guess you are in Switzerland at home.
That's correct. I'm at my home in Goldieville, which is out in the country in the Bernese Oberland, and it's very nice here. Comfortable. It's a beautiful spring. We have a nice view of the lake and the mountains. And we're relatively healthy in our later years. As far as I'm concerned, personally, at this moment, things are comfortable, I would say. But of course, all the concerns that occupy the collective mind all over the world right now about this pandemic are very present in my work and in my family, which is scattered. I have children, grandchildren in the United States, where the pandemic is also raging, and of course throughout Switzerland. So I have some concerns and worries, but personally I'm well, and I'm enjoying the first days of spring.
You say you are concerned. Can I ask you, how do you feel apart from being concerned?
It varies depending on who I'm talking to or what I'm doing. I spend quite a bit of my time working with analysans on Skype, and depending on where they are and what's happening with them, I can feel anything from very concerned for their well-being to reflective on their the ways they're coping with the situation, inner and outer. For myself, I'm quite aware of the dangers of the virus to people my age, so I'm very cautious about going out and being around people. I stay indoors mostly and try to get deliveries of essentials to our home. I can't say I'm anywhere near panic or feel a great deal of fear, but I would say concern is the word that would describe my mental state. When I wake up in the morning and I start thinking about the realities, I feel the sense of doom in the air and the darkness of the times. But as the sun comes up and the day appears and I get into it, that subsides. So I'm basically pretty even as a rule emotionally, and that's more or less, I've stayed close to my base during these days.
These days are forcing us into a lockdown. Where I am, Berlin is a partial lockdown. Where you are in Switzerland is a partial lockdown, but there are many, many countries where there is a full lockdown. Yes. So there are new routines. Parents are home with their kids, doing homeschooling, trying to work, trying to get their job, trying not to get fired. People, young or elderly, are home alone in a less nicer environment than yours and mine, perhaps. What could be happen psychologically, being forced at home for many, many weeks?
Well, this remains to be seen. I think a lot depends on how strict the lockdown is. I speak weekly with people in Wuhan who have been in their apartments now for nearly 2 months and are looking at another month before they can be fully released.
Yeah.
And that is a serious lockdown. They're very strong individuals. They've coped with it well. They have lots of resiliency, psychological resiliency, so they're doing quite well. But people who aren't in good psychological shape, of course, would be reacting very differently. Some people react with rebelliousness. These are strict parents now. We're seeing governments assume a role that we're not used to. We're used to having a lot of freedom, and adolescents don't react well to these kinds of rules and regulations. So you see rebellion, these kids on the beaches in Florida and so on. So that's one kind of reaction people can have. I'm not going to follow the rules. I don't like my strict parents, and I'm going to rebel against them. Another type of reaction is if you're really confined and you're alone, of course, depression can fall into a depression. And generally, under lockdown conditions, there is a tendency for the libido to regress, as we say. In other words, all the energy that we've been putting into making our plans, going around doing things, meeting with people, all that stops. And all the energy that's been poured into that suddenly comes to a halt and reverses. So now what? Well, as psychologists, Jungian psychologists, we know what happens when libido regresses. It activates the unconscious. And so a lot of fantasies start appearing in people's minds. There are all kinds of theories about what's going on in the world, and conspiracy theories and others. So I would say the unconscious is quite activated right now. We also look for big dreams during periods of regression when the unconscious is activated and the energy is within the inner world system. It can bring us very important symbolic dreams. These are to be expected during this time. I've seen some of that in my practice in these last few weeks in my own life. And people start also getting impatient. They want to go out. They feel cabin fever. I've spoken to some people who are, after a few days of being indoors, are getting very tired of it. And so they start feeling kind of angry. There are anger responses. And of course, family dynamics. I also speak to people who have children at home. Schools are closed. What to do with the small children, how to entertain them, how to keep them occupied. This is a huge problem for parents with small children, and they can't go out and play as they're used to. So you have to become very creative with them. It can increase stress in family dynamics, couples who don't get along very well ordinarily, but can avoid each other well enough by going to work and spending long hours apart from each other, now confined in a tight space together for periods of time. It can lead to severe conflicts, divorce. Probably there will be a lot of divorces coming out of this. Or it can lead to a lot more eros. And I expect in 9 months to see a huge surge.
Baby boom.
The birth rate, yeah. So it just depends how the couple is and what they do with this, how the dynamics develop. I think a lot of people also use social media and all the communication systems we have now, including television and Netflix and all that, to distract themselves, to offset the feeling of being imprisoned. It can even lead to addictions, alcohol addiction or drug addictions, to try to escape from the feelings that are generated by confinement, try to escape the prison by getting drunk or watching pornography or whatever people choose as their mode of addiction, and that can worsen. Meanwhile, also psychotherapy is going on now by Skype and telephone, so people are remaining in contact with their therapists. That could ease some of the situation if the therapist is available and they don't feel abandoned. They have somebody to talk to and share with. So yeah, it's a very unusual time. It has its opportunities and it certainly has its challenges, psychologically speaking.
You talked about rebellion. You talk about the loss of libido and the possible depression. There are other feelings or other emotions. There is also anxiety, there is panic, there is fear, there is solidarity, an enormous or a new solidarity. I have a very straightforward question for you. For those that are not in psychotherapy, for those that don't have a therapist right now, what would you suggest them? Last week I was talking to Verena Cast, and she said it's time to be or to become creative through imaginations, through painting. If you not can leave your house because you're in full lockdown, just to be creative and imagine what you will do when this is over, or what you were doing last year. To also have hope. Otherwise, as you said, we regress and we become negative.
Mm-hmm.
What could be your suggestion?
Well, I would agree with her that it is an opportunity to use imagination in a way that we might not otherwise, to explore what we call the inner world. To let images appear, to paint them, to draw them. To become creative. I don't think we can offer hope. I don't think therapists can offer hope. Hope comes from somewhere else. Hope has to come from within, or from within a person. They turn a corner, they feel hope, or they have a dream that indicates hope. But if we offer hope, it will be false hope. It won't hold up. So we can't. Maybe we can inspire hope just by being ourselves with people and showing them how we're coping with it. But I don't think we can offer hope. Hope is offered by religious traditions to some extent, by their teachings. People might find that a resource in this time. They might deepen their religious experience through meditation, or through reading the sacred texts and scriptures, through prayer. And maybe they'll develop a kind of creative prayer rather than just a rote prayer. So again, I agree with Verena that creativity would be a good way to go, but you can lead a horse to water, but the horse has to drink. You can say be creative, but some people find it very hard to be creative. It's the same thing in therapy, of course. In therapy, some people are very creative and do a lot with the therapy, and other people are rather flat and literal and don't have much access to their imagination.
Macron last week said we are at war. South African president said every citizen, male or female, is a soldier right now. First of all, I would like to ask you, do you buy this? Are we at war? And secondly, if we are at war with a virus, with something invisible. But at war, at least as European, you are North American, but European have experienced that war is the summa, is the greatest destructive movement, I would say. And after war, winner or loser, they have to face reconstruction. This time, if we are at war, there will be no reconstruction. Buildings will not have to be rebuilt, but there will be a lot to be rebuilt, what that could be. So the first question is, are we at war? Second, what will be to be rebuilt?
Well, a political leader is speaking to a nation, and he wants to mobilize that nation in a certain direction to take certain actions. And the way to mobilize a nation is to tell them they're at war, to have an enemy. It focuses the mind. It gets people to pay attention to things that normally they would ignore. For instance, going out in public. Until last week, people were sitting around in restaurants in Zurich, outdoors, even though they knew the coronavirus was around. They weren't paying any attention to it. They were ignoring it. Now, suddenly, the Swiss government has said this is an emergency situation. For the first time in I don't know how many years, maybe in Swiss history, they've declared a national emergency. That's like the Swiss declaring war. Switzerland hasn't had wars for hundreds of years. They don't know what a war is, so they don't use that word. But a national emergency is the same thing. It focuses the mind. You have got to pay attention. There are going to be police enforcing this. So people start doing what is necessary in order to overcome the danger that is threatening the nation. National leaders have to do that, and they use the rhetoric of war. I'm not against that. I think it's a way to mobilize the nation. And when you're at war, you also put lesser concerns aside. You stop worrying about whether you're going to get get your hair cut in exactly the right way, or whether you're going to be able to see this movie or that movie because the lines are long, and fretting about small things. You suddenly throw all that to the side, and you start thinking about something that's really, really essential, namely life and death. This is a life and death struggle. That's what they're telling people. And in fact, it is. Lots of people are dying from it, and many, many more will die from it if these measures aren't taken. The medical systems are on the verge of being overwhelmed. They will collapse. People will be dying in the streets because there are no hospital beds for them, or dying in their homes, dying wherever they can die, because there won't be medicine for them, there won't be ventilators for them. The medical doctors and nurses are falling by the wayside because they're sick. So it is very much like a war situation. Take it very seriously. And so to mobilize a collective during a time of crisis, you have to use this kind of extreme language. It gets the adrenaline going. It focuses the mind. So I think it's appropriate to talk that way. Now, what about after the rebuilding? After, there are going to be, the economists are saying it's going to take years to recover from this. The economy is going to be in terrible shape for years. We're going to go into a worldwide depression, they say. Now, if you remember the Great Depression from the 1930s, you're looking at breadlines, you're looking at unemployment in the range of 20 and 30%. You're looking at companies that have gone bankrupt and have to rebuild from scratch. You're looking at banks that have no money to lend them. And you're looking at people who are afraid to borrow money, because in a depression, nobody borrows money. You pull back, you save your money. So the consequences, the rebuilding is going to take a long time. We're in for a long period of struggle with this thing. And the rebuilding, I would guess, will take several years. And will it ever be the same as it was before? The wars transformed Europe. The huge destruction, what came out of it afterwards, was quite different from what these nations were like before. Some people say it's for the better, that the new Europe was better than the old Europe. Will the world after coronavirus be a better world? Will it be a more balanced world? Will it be a more sensitive world to resources and global climate change and all that kind of thing that will be much worse than coronavirus when that really takes effect on the human species? So maybe this is a wake-up call to start paying attention to what is really important, what are our basic values, and yes, community and helping in collective enterprises. Maybe it will spark some measure of altruism and generosity and giving of ourselves to community efforts. God knows we need that kind of mentality in the world and that kind of leadership. The world is not in good shape, wasn't in good shape before the coronavirus hit. And you can see now how fragile the structures were because they're all falling apart. And it will take a long time to rebuild them.
Before, when I was listening to you, something came to my mind as this lockdown is forcing us to stop with our frivolous life and frivolous activity and to the external, to the persona, and somehow going inside in the depth Some can do it, some cannot do it. But I want to continue on the war and perhaps the Great Depression, as you mentioned, and maybe even link it to what you said before about big dreams and your patient dreams. Do you see a possible turn like the turn after the Great Depression, so dictatorship? We are coming out from years of new populism, right-wing populism.
Yes.
What is your opinion?
What the political ramifications of this will be are hard to say. What the Great Depression did was, as you say, brought on the great dictators. There's a famous interview that Jung gave with the Knickerbocker, I think, magazine in the 1930s, called his views on the dictators. You know, in times like this, you see people wanting to look for a savior. They want an answer. And unbelievably, to my mind, they will fall for the most fantastic promises and constructions, as they did in the 1930s. That false hopes and false promises are given by these strong, quote, strong leaders, and people are looking for that. They're looking for a savior figure. So yes, it could. People are very worried about what this is doing to undermine democracy. Democracy is a very difficult way of governing. People governing themselves. It's full of conflict, full of argument, disagreement, and when you're at war. And when you're in a crisis, you don't want that. You want everybody heading in one direction. So that's what Hitler offered, Mussolini offered, the Emperor of Japan offered, even Roosevelt offered, the Americans a kind of very, very strong leadership. Churchill, de Gaulle, these are all very, very powerful leaders, and people look to them for guidance, for hope, for a sense of security, and that's where they're looking now. Israel is going through a tremendous crisis about its democracy now. Mm-hmm. So, I think there's a real danger that strong leaders will appear and convince enough people to follow them and to change the systems that we're used to, the democratic systems of discussion, dialogue, debate, disagreement, voting, all of that. I don't think the conviction that democracy is the best form of government that has been resident in the Western mind for 200 years is going to disappear. I think people will fight for democracy. I think people realize that in the long run, democracy works better than any alternative forms of government. But in the short run, if people panic and they're willing to buy the false promises of strong leaders, then there could be a period where certain laws will be suspended, human rights will be suspended, debate will be suspended in favor of what is cast to be survival issues. So that could very well happen in the near future.
Ulrich Beck, German sociologist who died 5 years ago, underlined that the risk society is asking us to look for methodological cosmopolitanism. And I sense this methodological cosmopolitanism is really what we have to face right now. This emergency cannot be run by one nation only. It's a European thing, is a global thing. And Europe is going to survive or die as a concept, as of a union. And apart from this, he also said, Ulrich Beck said that right now there is no distinction between nature and society, which means COVID-19 could be seen as nature, and nature is affecting society. Global risks are affecting society. There is a direct link, while in the past there was not. And this is also bringing us back to death, to war and death. I would like you to go back. You just mentioned death, but why are we so afraid of death? After Second World War, Westerners have put aside the concept of death.
There was a famous book that was written by Becker in the 1960s, I think, called The Denial of Death. So it isn't that death hasn't been on our mind. It's the big topic of existentialism, after all, and from Kierkegaard to Sartre. And so I don't think it's that people haven't been thinking about death, or at least intellectuals have been thinking about. Everybody has to think about death. I went with my wife to a doctor the other day because she was having some difficulties with an infection, not coronavirus, and something else. And he, as a side comment, said that if you have coronavirus and you take ibuprofen for, to reduce the fever, you will die. And he got very excited. He said, "You will die if you take an ibuprofen and you've got coronavirus." Death, he said, and he made a cross with his hand. I mean, he was, I would say, possessed by the numinosity of death in that moment. We sat in our chairs with big eyes. Wow, we didn't know ibuprofen could do that to you. He said, "It will put you in your grave." So the sense of death in the air, is much stronger right now than it was 2-3 weeks ago in Europe. No question about it. Now, the fear of death is archetypal. It's perennial. We're animals. We want to live. Every animal will do whatever it can to survive. It will bite its master. It will eat its master. It becomes cannibalistic. Certain animals will. Cats, they say, will. I don't know about dogs. They're a little friendlier to humans. But so, it's built into our nature to want to survive. It's an instinct, an ego instinct, I think Freud called it. And there is a fear of extinction, that we will lose our being. We will lose our essence if we die. We will be no more. And this fear of the void, of being nothing. Of course, some people like the idea. That's why they commit suicide. They want to get out of it. They want to be nowhere, nothing. Hamlet said, but to die, to dream, there's the rub. What if there's something after life? What happens then? And of course, religions have answered that question. There is life after death. Whether you go one place or another, or just be reborn in a reincarnation system, universally, archetypally, people have believed in life after death. In some form of existence continues after this life. And Jung said it's one of our jobs in later years to create a Weltanschauung that takes death into account, to have a theory of death, to have a construction of what, in our minds, what death means to us personally. And so as people come in contact with the immediate threatening presence of death, they will maybe start thinking about it, and what does it mean? Is there something after death? Will our existence, our soul, or the essence of our being continue in some form or not? Some years ago, I was on a boat, on a cruise, not a cruise ship, one of those big cruise ships, but we were in the Galapagos Islands on a boat, a tour boat that was taking us around the islands. And there were three parts of the occupants of this boat. 1/3 were the crew members who were Ecuadorian. 1/3 were Italians, and 1/3 were Americans. And at some point on the cruise, I got the idea. I don't know where it came from. I'm going to ask everybody. I'm going to take a poll, a survey on this boat, to ask people, do you believe in life after death? Yes or no? And if yes, is it personal or is it general, like you just become part of the whole or something? So I went around and I asked them. It was interesting that the crew members, who were all, I assume, Catholics and Ecuadorians raised traditionally, all said, oh yes, they believe in life after death, except the captain. And I was very glad he wasn't so sure, because it kept him on his toes a little more. The Italians all said, no, absolutely not. There is no life after death. And I found out they were all anti-clerical. You know, they thought the Pope was a joke. They really resented the church, all of that. So they all said no. The Americans, half the Americans said, the Americans tended to say yes, but not personal. I think one or two might have said it's personal, but mostly said, yes, we go on, but it's not personal. We sort of join the great cloud of being, or the sea of being, or something like that. And then I sat down with an Italian woman, just in conversation, and I asked her to explain her answer to me, because I was so surprised the Italians all said no. And she said, well, I said no because of my husband. He's really anti-religious. He's an atheist, but I'm not so sure. And then she told me this very moving story that she, after her mother died, she was sitting in her room by herself thinking about her mother, and suddenly she felt her mother's presence in the room. And something happened, I can't remember the details, that convinced her that her mother was there, that the spirit of her mother was there. And she said, so I think maybe there is something after life, but I can't say it publicly. So I think people have experiences that they don't like to talk about, or they feel sort of embarrassed because it's so against the zeitgeist to say something like, oh, there's life after death. But for myself, I'm quite sure there is. And many people I've told my stories about the butterfly to. I had experiences with a numinous butterfly some years ago. Tell me their experiences, that after somebody's death, strange synchronistic events happen, birds appear, or butterflies are a frequent symbol that come into the picture. I think when people focus on death, they start, especially if there are deaths in their near vicinity, they start noticing what I call synchronistic events around them that give them some hint that there is something beyond this material world that continues. There is a theory about religion, that religions are born out of the experience of death, because that's where you experience the spirits most strongly, the spirits of the ancestors that continue after you see that body being cremated or buried, that you experience the ancestors. And in many cultures, they have little areas of the house where they keep a picture or flowers, or one day of the year have a memorial for the ancestors, and believe that they do return from time to time, and they are present in the other world, in a subtle body world, as I think of it, or a symbolic world. So I think this coronavirus thing does bring the topic of death into the conversation, and people are afraid of it, of course. But I would hope they would look at it squarely and think about it. We're all going to die young, middle-aged, old, everybody eventually is going to have to face the question, unless you die suddenly in an accident or something, you will have to make a reflection on it.
The other day I was, luckily we're not in full lockdown, so I was in the woods with my daughters, and there were so many yellow butterflies. So it's very interesting what you just said. And my daughter asked me, Daddy, why there are so many butterflies? Well, perhaps now I have an answer for them. We talked about death, and I'm Italian. My country is really on its knees.
Absolutely.
Yesterday, almost 1,000 deaths.
Oh.
It's too much. It's really too much. We Jungians, and I would like to ask this question really with respect for those that lost their life and their families. We Jungians look at death metaphorically. And you wrote a very interesting book about midlife crisis. And you underline that in midlife crisis, something has to die. And what has to die is the persona, so that the self will be able to be, so that we will get in contact with ourself. Every crisis, every depression has a transformative push. You said it about wars and Europe before. What are the positive sides of this crisis, of this metaphorical death of our society as it is right now? I was shocked when I read yesterday in the news that dolphins were swimming in the Venice canals.
Yes, I saw that.
Nature is coming back. For me, COVID-19 is really nature telling us, hey guys, it's too much. Stop it now. Especially when world leaders, first of all, Trump, are denying climate change, are denying that we are really killing nature. And deniers are losers. But it seems nature find a way to stop everything.
Well, I think coronavirus is an extension of what was, in my mind, an extension of what was happening in Australia last winter, their summer, with these wildfires. You know, you see the consequences of our overconsumption of natural resources. Scientists estimate that we will exhaust this planet at this rate in 50 or 75 years. There just won't be enough of essentials, and the population is growing. So there will be all kinds of huge, terrible consequences. If we can learn from this, and that's a big if we can learn from these crises, these relatively small ones, I say these are horrible crises, but they're relatively small compared to what can come, then maybe we have a chance to take some actions that will offset worse things to come in the future, where nature will really show its disrespect for the human species, basically, that we have overstepped our boundaries. Hubris has to be brought low, and we're going to have to pay a huge price, which could be half the human population or more. So I look on these as wake-up calls, as indicators of things to come if we don't prepare ourselves to live in a different way. So what I would hope the game changer would be is that we are able to reconceptualize lifestyle. We're used to a very, very luxurious lifestyle. Yeah. And you think of all the travel, all the cruises, all the money spent on things that are basically luxury goods and unnecessary. And entertainment, yeah. All the energy that goes into that, which is mostly distracting from the anxieties that we feel. If we could come to terms with our proper proportion in the great scheme of things, in the global scheme of things, so that we can cut back our excessive consumption everything. Then the outcome of this would give the human species a chance to survive and make some fundamental decisions about how to go on this planet, because this cannot continue. As this exponential growth in population and consumption has taken place over the last 50 years, if you look at the charts, you see where it's headed, to a total collapse and disaster.
I agree. I hope that change will bring more pluralism, more respect, less top-down approach from some countries to the others, and really cosmopolitanism. Otherwise, we will face total destruction. And to my mind comes Jung's dream of the apocalypse, or this dream that nobody knows about, or almost nobody, only von Franz heard it from Jung. And that was so powerful that he was so scared to write about or even to share it too much. Yeah, hopefully we will be able to learn. Thank you, Mari.
Yes, thank you.